Buenas tardes con todos y con todas. Bienvenidos a las sesiones de verano del Seminario Permanente de Filosofía, organizado por la Sociedad Peruana de Investigación Filosófica Teorema y por el Círculo de Investigación en Filosofía Analítica de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. En esta oportunidad tenemos el placer de tener con nosotros al profesor Jeffrey King. El profesor Jeffrey King es profesor distinguido del Departamento de Filosofía de la Universidad de Rutgers en los Estados Unidos. Él es filósofo del lenguaje, se especializa en semántica formal, en lógica filosófica y en metafísica. Ha publicado numerosos artículos y libros, entre los que destacan Complex Demonstratives, The Nature and Structure of Content, New Thinking About Propositions, y muy prontamente un libro sobre el cual versa la charla del día de hoy, Felicitous, Underspecification and Updates. Así que tenemos el placer de tener con nosotros a Jeffrey King. Ahora, antes de comenzar, quisiera explicar muy rápidamente la mecánica de la sesión del día de hoy. Las preguntas, por favor, si hubiese preguntas, hay una persona asignada de recibir sus preguntas, las pueden escribir por el chat del Zoom. La persona es Andresa Bugatás. Si ven en sus pantallas, allí dice preguntas Andresa Bugatás. Cualquier pregunta que surja durante la charla pueden escribirla allí y él se encargará de plantearla al expositor. Bueno, sin más preámbulo, quiero darle el pase a Jeffrey King. So, Jeff, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you for what, as far as I could tell, was a very nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be giving a talk to you guys. Thanks for inviting me. My only regret is that I'm not giving it in your beautiful country. This is, I have a forthcoming book with Oxford University Press called Felicitous, Underspecification and Updating. And what I want to do today is sort of walk you through as much of the book as I can. And then following that, if I have time, I'll try and give you a highlight or a summary of the parts of the book that I wasn't able to cover. So hopefully I'll get to all that, but we'll see how it goes. It's arguable that the word I has a context invariant meaning that suffices to secure semantic values for it in context. And so you take I, you set it in the context, and its context invariant meaning picks out the speaker as a semantic value all by itself. But lots of contextually sensitive expressions aren't like that. And so consider the class of contextually sensitive expressions whose context invariant meanings arguably don't suffice to secure semantic values for the expressions in context. Expressions of this sort that have received most attention from philosophers are demonstratives and demonstrative pronouns. But I think this class of expressions is actually quite large. And among other things, it includes things like modals, conditionals, tense, gradable adjectives, possessives, the word only, quantifiers, and expressions that take implicit arguments such as ready in a sentence like Molly is ready. My own view about these expressions is that they differ from pure indexicals precisely in that their context invariant meanings don't suffice by themselves to secure semantic values for them in context. And as a result, they need to be supplemented in some way. The context invariant meaning needs to be supplemented in some way in context for the expression to cure a semantic value in context. And of course, the question of what form that supplementation takes is a very controversial question. But for this reason, I call this class of expressions supplementives, just to highlight the fact that they need to be supplemented in context to secure semantic values in context. And so these are the expressions I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to try and talk about a fair number of them. I claim that all these expressions have felicitous uses in which they haven't been assigned unique semantic values in context. Instead, I claim they're associated with a range of candidate semantic values in context. And I call such uses of these expressions instances of felicitous underspecification. So that's the phenomenon I want to be focusing on and saying a lot of different things about. And the book is devoted exclusively to this phenomenon and various aspects of it. So let's consider a really easy example just to get our ideas on the table here. This is actually a real life example. So Glenn and I are out surfing at Lost Springs Beach. There are some surfers to the south stretching about a quarter mile down the beach. And that northern end of that group, I'm watching those guys and I keep seeing them get these incredible waves, right? And so I look over at Glenn and looking down towards him, I say, those guys are good. Now, it seems easy to imagine that nothing in the context of utterance determined a unique group as the denotation, the semantic value of those guys. Parenthetical remark, I actually take those guys, I think Eduardo mentioned this in my book on complex demonstratives, I take it actually to be a quantifier. But I'm going to talk here as though it's an expression that denotes a group. And similarly, I'm going to treat demonstratives as though they designate individuals, even though I actually think those are quantifiers as well. Okay. So anyway, it's easy to imagine that nothing singled out a unique group when I uttered those guys are good as the denotation of those guys. I didn't intend a specific group, I can assure you, because I realized that it was kind of unclear exactly which the good guys were and so on. Okay, so, and it doesn't seem like anything else in context could have secured a group as the semantic value of those guys in that case. Instead, what I think is going on there is there's a range of overlapping groups, right, that are all legitimate candidates to be the semantic value of those guys in context. But despite this, my utterance is perfectly felicitous. Glenn had no qualms about it and took it to be perfectly acceptable. So this is an instance of felicitous underspecification, where again, the important point is no unique semantic value for the expression in context, but rather a range of candidate semantic values. So now let's get some other stuff on the table. Of course, Stalnaker. So following Stalnaker, let's take one important feature of the context utterance to be the set of propositions that conversational participants all take for granted, all believe that they all take for granted, all believe that they all believe take for granted, and so on for the purposes of the conversation. And that set of propositions, Stalnaker calls the common ground. Now that set of propositions determines a set of worlds, the worlds in which all those propositions are true. And again, following Stalnaker, we'll call that the context set. Following Stalnaker once more, I'm going to assume when someone asserts something and no one objects, that you update the context set with what was asserted. So if I say Donald Trump is a fool and no one objects, as they surely wouldn't, then we update the context set by removing worlds from it in which Donald Trump fails to be a fool. Now, the primary question I want to address today is this. In a case of felicitous underspecification, so if somebody utters a sentence containing an felicitous underspecified supplementive, and no one objects to the utterance, how do conversational participants update the context set? Now, I began thinking about this in terms of what the speaker asserts in such a case, but I think that's actually a less tractable question. And I'm not assuming that whatever the update is, it is what the speaker asserted. I happen to think that's true, but I'm not going to argue for that here today. So I'm just going to drop the question of what's asserted, not really worry about it, just say, how do people in fact update? Okay, so now for some ground rules. First, as my preliminary remarks have indicated, I'm going to be discussing this in a Stalnakerian framework in which the context set is a set of worlds. There are alternative frameworks in which to discuss this, but I don't think it really matters for our purposes. So I'm going to pick the simplest thing that will work. Second, I'm going to assume that in any case of an felicitous underspecified use of a supplementive, I'm going to assume it's common ground what the range of candidate semantic values are. Okay, and more specifically, what that means is that for any two worlds in the context set V and W, the range of candidate semantic values associated with a felicitous underspecified supplementive alpha at the context of utterance in W is the same as the range associated with alpha at the context of utterance in V, right? So in every world in the context set, the same range of candidate semantic values are associated with the supplementive in a case of felicitous underspecification. I think this is a slight idealization, but only slight. I think sometimes it can be a little unclear exactly what the range is, but I'm going to assume it's just clear and it's common ground. Third, I'm not going to be considering cases in which there's a range of candidate semantic values for a supplementive, and then a sentence is uttered containing the supplementive, and it has the effect of changing the range of candidate semantic values for the supplementive in context, right? This happens most easily, I think, with the case of gradable adjectives. So imagine there's a case where there's a certain range of values from the threshold for tall in a context. And then I say John isn't tall, and thereby eliminate, and it's accepted, and thereby eliminate some candidate thresholds for being tall that are at or below John's height. Okay, so that's a case where the range of candidate semantic value changes with the utterance of a sentence containing a underspecified supplemented, but I'm not going to be considering cases like that. I'm interested in cases in which the candidate semantic values in context remain fixed after the utterance and the utterance is accepted. Okay, and that's another thing. I'll be confining my attention to the cases where the utterance is accepted. Fourth, I want to make clear that as I understand this phenomenon, Felicitous underspecification, it's a case of, as I've been saying, it's a case of a supplementive not having a unique semantic value in context, and rather having a range of candidate semantic values associated with it in context. It's not a case of a felicitous use of a supplementive where it is assigned a unique semantic value in context, but conversational participants are ignorant about what it is. Maybe that's a real phenomenon, I'm not actually sure, but that's not the phenomenon I'm talking about. Okay. Some people tend to conflate these two things, and I want to keep them very separate. Okay. Okay, so now let's turn to Craig Roberts. So I'm trying to get all this machine around the table I need. Now let's turn to Craig Roberts and questions under discussion. This is going to sound way more complicated. Oh, yeah.
May I ask a basic question?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was wondering how to distinguish between underspecification and vagueness. So does underspecification entail vagueness, or what is the relation between these concepts?
I think probably vagueness is a case of underspecification, at least in some instances with gradable adjectives, for example. But in other cases, and I think part of me wants to say, wait and you'll see, but in other cases, I think it feels like something very different from vagueness. Because, for example, in some cases, there will only be two candidate semantic values, and that doesn't look anything like vagueness. It's just these two different things. So maybe once you start to see some examples, if you still have that question, ask again. But I think it'll be clear that some of these things are not like vagueness. So I think vagueness is an instance of felicitous underspecification, probably. Does that help?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you.
You know, it's a good question. It's a good question. Okay, so Robert's questions under discussion. So Roberts assumes that, and here's where the handout's very helpful. Look at the handout. Robert assumes that the elif of a question like who arrived is who lambda x dot x arrived, where the wha element has been raised to wide scope in the main clause, and the main clause is an abstract on its trace. Okay, that really won't be important, but the Q alternatives for a question whose LF has n wha elements stacked in front, okay, are as follows. And this is the Q alternatives. It's a set of propositions. It's a set of propositions such that you take n elements from the domain corresponding to the n wha expressions that front the thing, and then take the denotation of the embedded part of the question, the thing that's embedded relative to all the wha phrases. Take the denotation of that, apply it to those n things, and you get a proposition, right? So it's just this big set of propositions. Now that sounds like a bit of a mouthful. Sorry, where D is the domain of the model, sort of restricted to humans for who, and non-humans for what, and bar, beta, bar is the denotation of beta. Now that sounds kind of complicated, but it's way simpler than that. So this is the part that you really need to know as opposed to what I just said. What you really need to know is that in a model where the domain is Mary, Cindy, and Rebecca, and in which invite is irreflexive, you can't invite yourself, the Q alternatives for who did Mary invite is a set of propositions, Mary invited Cindy and Mary invited Rebecca. So it's really a pretty simple idea, I hope you see. And we're only going to be concerned with questions with at most one wha element. So the thing I just said is the important thing to know, and I think it's a pretty simple idea, right? Okay, now so what about polar questions? And we're going to talk about some of those. We have zero wha elements, that is yes/no questions. There will be zero existential quantifiers in the definition of the set of Q alternatives, and we'll take the set of Q alternatives to be a singleton set consisting of one proposition. So again, this is the only thing you need to know. The set of Q alternatives for does Glenn ski is the set of propositions containing the one proposition Glenn skis, right? So it's just the yes answer basically, right? That's the Q alternative. Okay, now a partial answer to a question alpha is a proposition that together with the common ground entails that at least one member, that entails that at least one Q alternative is true or is false, right? So a partial answer settles at least one Q alternative, right? A complete answer settles all the Q alternatives. Okay. And so notice complete answers are partial too, but they're not merely partial. Okay, and then finally on this question stuff, say that an answer phi to a question alpha in context C is a better answer to alpha than is psi in C. Just in case phi together with a common ground in C settles more of alpha's Q alternatives than psi does. So notice what this means. It means that no complete answer to a question is better than any other because they all settle all the Q alternatives. And notice too that phi could be a better answer to alpha in C than psi is, even though, for example, phi is false and psi is true. So being a better answer, maybe this is bad terminology, but being a better answer is just a matter of how many Q alternatives you settle and does not address whether you settle them correctly or incorrectly. Right? It's just a sheer number. Okay, so now that's the machinery I need on the table. And now we can turn to some examples. And I should just say, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give some examples of Felicitous underspecification. I'm going to make a claim about how we update in each case. Then I'm going to go and formulate an update rule, go back and apply it until it predicts what we observe to be the proper updates. And then I'm going to do some other stuff. But in the near future, that's what I'm doing. Okay, so first example, let's,
Sorry, yeah, this is kind of a general question, but it's something that kind of bothers me a lot when I read about context. And it's kind of having two different conceptions of context, or at least two different conceptions of context. Like one of them is just, the concrete situation in which an utterance happens. And the other is more like an abstract, formal conception of context that it's not clear how it is related to the concrete thing. So I wonder if you have any stand on this. I mean, where do you stand in this kind of division, or if it's relevant? I don't know.
I tend to think that context should be understood as the concrete thing. But then I think sometimes in doing formal work, you can use formal representations of the concrete thing that could just be a tuple, for example. But presumably, given any concrete thing, it will uniquely determine the relevant tuple, right? So if the concrete speech situation includes that I'm speaking, then the tuple will have me as speaker, for example, right? And I take it for, I think you're thinking of the difference between Lewis and Kaplan over here. And I think Lewis liked the concrete situation view of context. Kaplan didn't dislike that, but he just took himself to be, in a very simple way, modeling the features of the concrete situation that were important for his formal semantics. And so I tend to think there's not really any competition between these two conceptions. I think one is just a simplification. The technical formal tuple thing is just a simplification for doing formal work of the concrete thing. That's the way I tend to view it.
I guess there are some complications when people talk about this context, these cases where the person that might be counted as speaker of the context is not really what might be the referent of, say, the first person pronoun. I'm talking about like recorded messages or those sorts of things. I mean, sometimes complications arise in those cases, but maybe that's going.
Well, yeah. No, I think what you're bringing out, Frank, this is actually important. I've written something about this, but I think what you're bringing out is, here's a different way to put it. You want to evaluate, I exist or whatever it's going to be, relative to a context where the thing that is the speaker is not speaking, right? Because consider, Kaplan talks about this. Consider the sentence, "I'm not speaking." You want to be able to evaluate that in the context where the speaker isn't speaking. So there's some really dicey things there. I agree. And this really makes you wonder, what does it mean to say that somebody's the speaker of the context? I just think it's just something you impose on the context. So in other words, if there's a physical situation, actually this is very helpful, honey. There's a physical situation consisting of me and Eduardo silently looking at each other. There's two contexts there, at least. The one in which he's the speaker and the one in which I'm the speaker. So that gets super messy. That's it.
Yeah, it's helpful, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Yeah,
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question about the notion of felicitousness that you are assuming. So it is defined by, so if the listener is not complaining about the utterance, that make it felicitous necessarily, or?
Yeah, so when I try to decide these things, I give informants the scenario, and I say the sentence is uttered, and I say, do you find anything wrong with that or bad about that or something like that? So that's the kind of notion I have in mind. It's funny you should ask this, because philosophers and linguists toss around this notion of felicity and infelicity a lot, and I don't know if you can precisely define it, but it's something like native speakers will find nothing wrong with the utterance, right? Something like that.
Okay.
And that's why you picked up on exactly what I was aiming at. Because I said, in the example I gave, I said, Glenn didn't find anything weird about my utterance, and he took it to be perfectly acceptable, right?
Yeah, I was thinking in cases. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was thinking in cases in which the listener is caritative with the speaker, so maybe it's not felicitous, but I will add something to make it felicitous.
I'm not sure what you have in mind there.
Sorry?
I just wasn't understanding what you had in mind.
So I don't have an example in my mind, but if I have something, I will tell you.
It sounds to me like the kind of thing you have in mind, I would consider a repair strategy, and hence probably not a fully felicitous utterance. If it's really felicitous, it should just be acceptable the way it was uttered. You shouldn't have to do anything to repair or fix it up or anything like that.
Okay.
And by the way, I want to stress, I think there's lots of underspecified uses that are completely infelicitous. Watch me do one. He's smart. Okay, that's bad, right? And it's certainly underspecified. There's no unique semantic value associated with either, I think, but that's just bad. So I want to stress, I guess, that I think it's surprising that you can get felicitous underspecified uses. I think that's a surprising thing, particularly as I'm going to talk about in the case of pronouns, demonstratives, and possessives. I think it's very surprising. Okay. So I'm going to assume, so here's our first example, our second example of a felicitous underspecified supplementive, and I'm going to begin with tense. And I'm going to assume that a tense qua contextually sensitive expression is looking to be assigned a temporal interval or a time in context. And so, for example, if I say I was at Mammoth, that past tense is looking for a time in the past, so that I'm saying something like I was at Mammoth at T. Okay. I should say I'm trying to remain neutral on the question of the semantics of tense, because it's a very controversial issue in philosophy of language and linguistics. But I'm assuming however tense works, it's contextually sensitive and it's looking for a temporal interval in context as its semantic value. So suppose it's common ground that Jamie took a 1-month vacation in either May, July, or September. And suppose we're in a conversation about Jamie's vacation. We don't care when he went on his vacation. That's just not of concern to us at all. What we care about is what he did, where he went, and things like that, right? We're concerned about what happened on the vacation, where it was. We don't care what month it was. So you say to me, where did Jamie go on his vacation? So that's the immediate question under discussion. And I say Jamie went to Costa Rica. Now here it's easy to imagine that nothing about the context determines one of those months as opposed to the other as the semantic value of the tense. Nonetheless, the utterance is felicitous. So this looks like a felicitous underspecified use of a tense, where May, July, and September are the candidate semantic values for the tense in context. And I should say, I'm assuming, and this is true of every theory of tense I know of, that tenses can't be assigned discontinuous temporal intervals. It's got to be a continuous temporal interval. So you can't assign it, May, July, September. Okay, I think if you write up a theory like that of tense, you're going to have massively overgenerate regions of sentences. Okay, so for each candidate semantic value, and here it's May, July, and September, consider the proposition resulting from assigning it to the tense as its semantic value in context. And that gives you the propositions 1A through C, Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, Jamie went to Costa Rica in July, Jamie went to Costa Rica in September. I'm putting the date because I realized that some of this is it's all in the future, which I didn't intend. Right? So call those things the candidate propositions for one in context. And that is 1A through C are the candidate propositions. So the candidate propositions are just the result of assigning the candidate semantic values to the original sentence. The fact that one is felicitous and we've got the present range of candidate semantic values means that given the conversational purposes of the conversation at the point in which one was uttered, they're adequately served by associating the tense with a range of candidate semantic values, and the conversational purposes don't require assigning the tense unique semantic value. Notice I was careful to say we don't care about what month it was. And that's kind of the point. For our conversational purposes, that doesn't matter, right? Okay, so it's natural to think that conversational participants here update with a proposition that is insensitive to those differences between the candidate semantic values. And given that what month Jamie took vacation isn't important, but where he went is, and given that the months I've mentioned are the live options for being the semantic values in context for the tense, the update here seems to be the proposition that during one of those months, Jamie went to Costa Rica. That is, conversational participants update with the disjunction of candidate propositions in context. Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, or Jamie went to Costa Rica in July, or Jamie went to Costa Rica in September. I take it that's how the update goes there. So let's call the proposition participants update with, in cases of felicitous underspecification, the propositional update. So distinguish two things: the candidate propositions in context, that's 1A through C, and then the propositional update, that's their disjunction, okay, in this case. Okay.
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So I was wondering so probably in that case, when Jamie went to Costa Rica, we probably wouldn't care if he toured around Costa Rica or whether he just went to one city in Costa Rica. So I was curious if there was another kind of, I imagine you'll disagree, but I'm curious as to why one wouldn't say that there's also another kind of underspecification in terms of what Costa Rica is doing.
I see. Because I don't consider any of those things to be part of the proposition that in general would be semantically expressed. I don't think when you say Jamie went to Costa Rica, you're semantically expressing either the proposition that he stayed in one city or that he moved around. I think you're just expressing the proposition that he went to Costa Rica, stop, right? Now you could, of course, express a more complicated proposition by adding linguistic material. But I take it if you say Jamie went to Costa Rica, that's just a unique proposition that Jamie went to Costa Rica, right? And to come back to what you were saying, then that leaves open lots of possibilities about what he did in Costa Rica, right?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of whether somebody could say the same thing for the past tense, that he just went he just went to Costa Rica and that's it. Like there's not specific time that I'm worried about. So something analogous to that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I reject that theory of tense. That it's just a simple existential quantifier over past time. So it could have been 2,000 years ago, right? I reject that theory of tense, and really I'm following Barbara Partee here, who says things like, if you say I turned off the stove, you're not saying there's a past time when I turned the stove off, like 30 years ago or something like that. And that wouldn't make it true that you turned the stove off, I think, in a normal conversation, right? Or I didn't turn the stove off. Even, I mean, the fact that 30 years ago you failed to turn the stove off wouldn't make that true in a particular conversation now, right? Does that make sense? So I said I was going to be neutral on tense. Okay, so I'm not really fully neutral. I reject theories of tense of that sort. That past phi just means sometime in the past phi. Future phi just means sometime in the future phi. Not to say you couldn't express those things, but I think when we use tense in ordinary conversations, we're not doing that. I think we're doing something much more specific. So if I tell you I went to Costa Rica, just imagine normal conversation. Usually you're going to have some particular past in mind, some particular past time in mind when you say things like this. Does that make sense? Now,
yeah,
how you
totally.
now how you actually implement that is an open question, but that's the theory of tense I'm imagining. Good, that's helpful. Okay, so the moral I want to draw from the Jamie example is just this. I think how these propositional updates get determined is the following. You've got a felicitously underspecified supplementive. You consider the candidate propositions, and that's the result of assigning the individual candidate semantic values to the tense or whatever it is, and that generates a series of propositions. Those are the candidate propositions in context. And then I take it the propositional update is a result of performing some operation on the candidate propositions. In this case, it was disjoining them. And as we'll see, in the cases I'm going to look at here, there are only two operations. You either disjoin them or you conjoin them. There's something slightly a little bit different that you can do as well, but I'll get to that. Okay, so since we just considered a disjunctive update, let's see if we can get a conjunctive one. So here's my sort of attempt at that. Suppose it's common ground that Annie has Monday and Wednesdays off, and that it's common ground that on her days off, she goes to various beaches. Annie's my wife, and she does go to various beaches. So we're interested in which beaches Annie went to this week on her days off. So you ask me, where did Annie go to the beach? So that's the immediate question under discussion. I say Annie went to Lossman. Now here, arguably, the tense is not assigned a unique semantic value in context, with the candidate semantic values being Monday and Wednesday. This kind of addresses again what you were asking about, because when I say Annie went to Lossman, I'm not saying sometime in the past she went to that beach, right? Okay. So the candidate values for the tense are Monday and Wednesday, and so the candidate propositions are 2A and 2B. Annie went to Lossman on Monday, Annie went to Lossman on Wednesday. And here it seems that conversational participants update with the conjunction of those two. She went Monday and Wednesday. One bit of evidence for this is one way to deny two. Well, ways to deny two are these 2O. No, Annie went to Riviera on Monday. Or 2O prime. No, Annie went to T Street on Wednesday. Right? Either of those would be a way of denying two. A second bit of evidence for the claim that two, the update associated with two is the conjunction of 2A and 2B, is that what you learn in hearing two is the conjunction of 2A and 2B, right? Okay, so here we have another specified use of a tense in a conjunctive update, okay? So that's nice. We've got a disjunctive case and a conjunctive case. Now I'm going to give you a third kind of case, which is a little different. So for a fine example, suppose it's common ground that Glenn's schedule allows him to surf on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's also common ground that he sometimes surfs those days and sometimes doesn't, but he always surfs either both days or neither, right? Okay, so we want to schedule a meeting on Tuesday or Thursday this week, and we want Glenn to be there, and it's common ground that if he's going surfing, he can't make the meeting. So you ask me whether Glenn can make the meeting. So this is the immediate question under discussion. I say Glenn is going surfing. Now it's arguable here that the time or time interval assigned to the tense, no unique time or time intervals assigned to the tense in context. It seems as though Tuesday and Thursday are both candidate semantic values for the tense in context. And coming back to who was asking, was it Edvard was asking about vagueness? This stuff shouldn't feel like vagueness, I hope, at all. Whatever's going on. Okay, so this means the candidate propositions for 3 in context are 3A and 3B. Glenn's going surfing Tuesday, Glenn's going surfing Thursday. But now, since in every rule in the context set, he surfs both Tuesday and Thursday or neither, 3A and 3B update the context set in the same way. They're different propositions, but they update the context set in the same way, as do their disjunction and conjunction. All these things update the context set in the same way. So clearly here, conversational participants update the context set in the way that each of 3A and 3B would. They just don't have any choice because there's just a univocal update there. So in this case, it would be misleading to talk about the propositional update, since conversational participants can update with either of the propositions, or for that matter, their conjunction and disjunction. And so for obvious reasons, I call these doesn't matter updates, because when you look at the candidate propositions, you realize it doesn't matter which one you update with, the result's going to be the same. Okay, so in the case of tense, and I wanted to stick with one supplemental to march through these three kinds of examples. We saw 3 different kinds of updates. There was the conjunction of candidate propositions in context, their disjunction, and now it doesn't matter update. Okay, and I'll say this is true of supplementatives generally. They all have these 3 kinds of updates, okay? So I wanted to march through one example, tense, and show you all 3 updates. Now I'm just going to talk about examples using different supplementatives, but I don't have time in each case to march through all 3 updates. So I'm just asserting that all these supplementatives have all 3 kinds of updates. Okay. It's so good to assert something without argument in FOSS. It feels so liberating, right? Okay, so let's look at now a case of possessive. So suppose it's common ground that Perez owns a car and leases a car, and he drives each frequently. And if someone were to point to either of these cars and say, whose car is that? We would all say Perez's. it's common ground that Perez's friend Cindy, who has no car, has to get to a job interview today. And you asked me how Cindy got to her interview. So that's the immediate question under discussion. And I say Cindy got to her interview by borrowing Perez's car. Now, suppose that nothing in our conversation hangs on which car of Perez's Cindy borrowed. We're solely concerned with how she got downtown. Was it an Uber? Was it a Metro? Was it a borrowed car? Did somebody drive her, right? So we don't care which of Perez's cars was borrowed. We just want to know if it was that or Metro or Uber or what, right? We can suppose that it's common ground that Cindy availed herself of only one means of getting downtown, as we naturally think in such a case. Now, I think that possessives are looking to be assigned two-place relations in context. So for example, John's book might be assigned the relation the Y that X wrote in context, with the result that John's book is good, expresses the proposition that the book John wrote is good. It could instead be the relation the X that Y edited, right? And when we say John's book is good, that would mean the book John edited is good, and so on. So in the present case, the possessive doesn't seem to be assigned a unique semantic value in context. 8 seems perfectly felicitous. The candidate semantic values for the possessive in 5 in context are the following two-place relations. X owns Y and X leases Y, one for the loaned car, one for the leased car, right? And so the following propositions are candidate propositions for 5 in context. Cindy got to her interview by borrowing the car Perez owns. Cindy got to her interview by borrowing the car Perez leases. So we have a felicitous underspecified use of a possessive here, and I take it we update with the disjunction of 5A and 5B. Here again, evidence in favor of this view is that in rejecting 5, we seem to be rejecting the disjunction of 5A and 5B. And again, in being told 5, what you learn is the disjunction of 5A and 5B. Okay, so that's felicitous underspecified use of a possessive. Now let's turn to only, one of my favorites. I'm assuming that uses of only are assigned alternative sets in context. So if I say only John feed, and the alternative set is, what do I have here? John, Susie, and Matt. Only John feed is true just in case John feed and Susie and Matt didn't, right? So that's what only is looking for, is an alternative set, and only John feed basically says John's the only member of the alternative set who feed, right? That's how only works. So the takeaway here is the semantic value in context of only is a set, an alternative set. Okay, now hearing Ted Cruz is again a real story. Hearing Ted Cruz during the 2016 US presidential campaign infamously compared his denial of the well-established fact that the climate is warming to what he claimed was Galileo's denial that the earth is flat, I turned to my wife and said, only Ted Cruz compares himself to Galileo. As I'm sure you noticed, a lot of you were smiling. Ted Cruz, of course, was confused. Galileo did not deny it was flat. He denied it was stationary. But, you know, of course, Ted Cruz is going to get the science wrong every time. Okay. Now, surely it could be that there was no unique alternative set assigned to only in context. I certainly didn't intend the alternative set to be everybody since Galileo's birth or something like that. I didn't even intend it to be everybody currently on Earth, because I'm well aware that some other people probably did make Galileo self-comparisons. Roughly, I was tending to convey the claim something like, no one other than Cruz, who is the sort of political person he is, compares himself to Galileo. And given that, a number of alternative sets spring to mind. So one would be being a US politician in the 2016 election cycle. One would be being a prominent US politician. One would be being a prominent world politician. And one would be being a prominent person in political circles in the United States. But I didn't intend any of these to be the alternative set, and my wife didn't take me to intend any one of them. So it looks like we have a felicitous underspecified use of only, with, again, the range of candidate semantic values here being the different alternative sets that we can fill in. So assuming those candidate semantic values, the ones I just mentioned, are the candidate semantic values, the candidate propositions for 7 in context are 7A through 7D. I'll just read 7A. Cruz compared herself to Galileo, another US politician in the 2016 election cycle did. No other prominent US politician did. No other prominent world politician did. No other prominent person in political circles in the US did. Now here, conversational participants update, I claim, with the conjunction of 7A through 7D. One piece of evidence in favor of this is that my wife could legitimately object to what I said by uttering any of the following. That's not right. Jeb Bush compared himself to Galileo. That's not right. Louis Gohmert compared himself to Galileo. That's not right. No, Miguel Farage compared himself to Galileo. That's not right. Ann Coulter compared himself to Galileo. So notice I picked individuals from each of the alternative sets there to illustrate this. But the following would seem really out of place. If my wife would object, no, that's not right. Yanni compared himself to Galileo. I mean, I think, what? What does Yanni have to do with what I'm talking about? Or Cher, that's not right. Cher compared himself to Galileo. So presumably the immediate question under discussion, this will be important later, here is, did some US politician in the 2016 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US, other than Ted Cruz, compare him or herself to Galileo? Okay, so that's Olmi. Now finally, I think this is, well, no, I think maybe one more. Oh, no, we'll see. Finally, let's turn to a felicitous underspecified use of a pronoun. Now, from talking about this material in a variety of places, I've discovered that people are really resistant to the idea that you can get felicitous underspecified uses of singular pronouns and simple and complex demonstratives. I encounter tremendous resistance on this point. So I've got tons of examples in the book of these cases because people object. I've noticed for some reason, interesting sociological fact, direct reference theorists are particularly resistant to the idea that these things can be felicitous and underspecified. I have no idea why that is, but it's a fact. Okay, so suppose 5 women are interviewing you for a job. As you open the door and leave, one says, you'll get a call from us today telling you if you got the job. And I overhear this as you're exiting the door. As we walk away together, you utter the following. She'll probably call at the end of the day. The utterance is felicitous, but it seems clear the pronoun has no unique semantic value in context. And presumably here, the candidate semantic values are each of the interviewers. And so the candidate propositions for 19 in context are the propositions resulting from assigning each of the interviewers as the semantic value of she in context. And surely here, conversational participants update with the disjunction of candidate propositions in context. And the immediate question under discussion here is apparently, when will you probably get a call telling you whether you got the job? I should say, by the way, you may have noticed in some cases, the question under discussion is explicitly asked. In other cases, you infer what it is from what the assertion was. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the question under discussion literature, it's pretty widely assumed that virtually every time you assert something, there's some question under discussion, whether it was explicitly asked or not. So if it was not explicitly asked, you've kind of got to read it off what you asserted. And you're basically saying, given you asserted that, what question you were trying to answer? And that's taken to be the immediate question under discussion. So in this case, it's implicit, right? Okay, so now I want to specify or formulate an update rule for felicitous underspecification. This is going to be a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to,
Sorry,
yes.
can I ask you a quick question before that? So
Sure,
what about an
sure.
example with here? Like I say, like, hey, I already got here, or I just got here. And it's not, yeah.
Good. Look, I mean, that's a really good question, right? One of the things I think you've just sort of shown is that a lot of times people say here is a pure indexical like I, but your point just shows that can't quite be right, because here, the context and variant meaning doesn't suffice to pick out a unique semantic value by itself. Because when I say I just got here, do I mean the house? Do I mean the block? Do I mean the city? Do I mean the country? You know, and it, you know, somehow something's got to, well, when it is determinate which thing here is doing, something's got to determine that other than the context and variant meaning. But I think your point is a very good one. Namely, in some cases, when I say I just got here, there is no unique semantic value. It's left open, whether it means the house, the block, or so forth, right? Good, that's good. Yeah, by the way, I think this is something exactly, the same thing is true of now. And so I actually think if there is any pure indexical, probably I is the only one. I think all these other expressions, here, now, even today and tomorrow, have uses where, well, their context and variant meanings don't by themselves pick out unique semantic values. Take today. I went swimming today versus today people stream lots of live content on their computers. That second thing does not mean, you know, Monday, you know, right? Okay. So, given an LF in context C containing felicitous underspecified supplement of sigma with range of candidate semantic values R and C, conversational participants consider the range of candidate propositions in context C for the LF, and they consider the immediate question under discussion. If the candidate propositions for phi would update the context set differently, if that's the case, then they update as follows. Then this rule kicks in, and I'll come back to that, what I just said in a minute. Given C's context set CS, update with the weakest candidate propositional update for phi and C, if any, such that one, it gives a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion while adhering to Griesing maxims and not being ruled out by the common ground. And two, no stronger candidate propositional update for phi and C gives a better answer to immediate question under discussion than does U, while adhering to Griesing maxims and not being ruled out by the common ground. Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to explain why it's intuitive, believe it or not, in a minute. But if notice FUU leaves open whether there's a propositional update satisfying the conditions laid out. It says update with the propositional update U for C, if any, which blah. So it's possible that there's no propositional update that satisfies these conditions. In that case, we'll say that FUU is undefined for phi in C, and we'll say that C is inappropriate for phi. And what we predict in that case is infelicity, just to be clear, okay? So I'm going to talk about this later if I get time, but I define a notion of appropriateness with the prediction that an LF in inappropriate context is infelicitous. And that's basically because the update rule is undefined. So assuming, as we have been, that the candidate propositional updates for an LF phi in C, it's either the conjunction of candidate propositions for phi in context or the disjunction, right? Given that, and given that disjunctions are weaker than conjunctions, FUU says to update with the disjunction of candidate propositions for phi and C, if it's a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion, doesn't violate Griesing maxims, isn't ruled out by the common ground, and the conjunction of candidate propositions for phi and C either does not give a better answer to the immediate question under discussion, or violates a Griesing maxim, or is ruled out by the common ground, okay? And if the conjunction of candidate for propositions, if the conjunction of candidate propositions for phi and C does give a better answer to the immediate question under discussion, while not being ruled out by the common ground and violating no maxim, FUU rules out the disjunction of propositions in context as the update. And so the conjunction of candidate proposition in context is trivially the favored propositional update in that case, okay? Because it's trivially, since the disjunction is ruled out, the conjunction is triviously the weakest propositional update satisfying all the relevant conditions. Okay. Now, ultimately, the proof of FUU, the update rule, is that it gets the right updates. That seems like a pretty good thing to require of an update rule. But I also think, as I indicated a while ago, I also think that it's got intuitive backing as well. And so let me unpack it a little. Hopefully this will help you understand the rule too, but let me unpack it a little and say why I think it's just intuitive. Okay, so what does it say? It says to update with the weakest candidate propositional update that gives a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion, violates no Griesing maxim, is not ruled out by the common ground, and where there's no stronger candidate that gives a better answer while adhering to Griesing maxims not being ruled out by the common ground. That's what FUU says. That the update must give a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion is just a requirement that it's relevant to the local conversational goal of answering that question, right? Seems like a good requirement that it be relevant to whatever question is being addressed. That the update be the weakest one to give the best answer without being ruled out by the common ground or violating maxim is just a requirement that the speaker make the least commitment she can while giving the best answer she can to the immediate question under discussion. And that seems like a good intuitive thing to do. Make the least commitment you can to best answer the question, right? Seems like it's a win-win. That the update violate no Griesing maxims is just a requirement that it coheres with accepted principles governing conversation generally. And that the update doesn't conflict with the common ground is just a requirement that the update not conflict with what conversational participants are presupposing. Some of you might remember that Stalnaker in Context and Content notes that it's a general principle governing conversation or governing assertion that you don't assert what you presuppose to be false. So it seems quite plausible that our update rule would require conversational participants to update with something, but not to update with something presupposed to be false. It just seems like a corollary of Stalnaker's idea. So as I said, I think FUU has good intuitive backing in addition to hopefully getting the right results, as I'll now proceed to show. So, well, one other thing. Notice I gave an example of a doesn't matter update notice that in the case of doesn't matter update, FUU isn't triggered. Why isn't it triggered? It's not triggered because in the case of a doesn't matter update, there's only one way you could update, the way all the candidate propositions in fact do. They all update the same way. So you just got no choice. So FUU isn't triggered. What triggers FUU is conversational participants look at the candidate propositions and see they would update the context set differently. Now they've got a problem because they want a univocal update. And FUU is a rule for getting you from candidate propositions that would update the context differently to a univocal update. That's its job. So it's only triggered when the candidate propositions, in fact, would update the context set differently. So go back to 5, the case of Cindy and Perez and the borrowed cars. In this case, the candidate propositions would update the context set differently, so FUU is triggered. Assuming the immediate question under discussion is how did Cindy get to her interview, and assuming for simplicity that the Q alternatives here are Cindy got her interview by borrowing the car Perez owns or the car he leases, Cindy got her interview by Uber, or Cindy got her interview by Metro. The conjunction and disjunction of candidate propositions for 5 in context are both complete answers to the immediate question under discussion. But that means, according to FUU, that we pick the weaker one. Okay, so that means FUU predicts we update with the disjunction, and that's just what we observed. Okay, good. The conjunction is actually ruled out by the common ground in this case too, but I'm not concerned with that because the idea is if both the conjunction and the disjunction are complete answers to the immediate question under discussion, FUU says update with the weaker one, this disjunction, and that again is what we observe. So FUU makes the right prediction here. Okay, so let's now go over to Olney. In the case of Olney and 7, we claimed that we update with the conjunction of 7A through 7D. We claimed that the immediate question under discussion was, did some US politician in 2016 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in US other than Ted Cruz, compare himself to Galileo? The set of Q alternatives for this question is a singleton set of the following proposition. Some US politician in the 2016 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US other than Ted Cruz, compare himself to Galileo. Now, the disjunction of 7A through 7D does not settle that Q alternative. And I'll let you work that out, but it doesn't. So it's not even a partial answer to the immediate question. Here you're either a complete answer or you're not a partial answer. There's no wiggle room. The conjunction of 7A through 7D does settle the sole Q alternative. It settles it as false. So it's a better answer to the immediate question under discussion than the disjunction. And there's nothing in the common ground that rules it out. It doesn't violate any Grice maxim. So in this case, FUU says update with the conjunction. Okay. Do I want to say anything more about that? No. Okay. So next, let's get to the case of the pronoun. So that was the case where you were interviewed by 5 women. The candidate proposition for 19 in context with the result of signing each interviewer as the semantic value of she in 19. And we claimed that we update with the disjunction of these propositions. Here again, I think the common, well, here the common ground rules out the conjunction, but FUU, even if it didn't, FUU would predict update with the disjunction, as I'll show you. But I think the common ground rules out the conjunction. Recall that the interviewer said, you'll get a call from us today telling you if we got the job. And here I think world knowledge that is common ground tells us in such a case that only one interviewer will call. In general, prospective employees are only told once that they did or didn't get the job. So FUU predicts the conjunction is ruled out as the update. We assume that the immediate question under discussion is, when will you probably get a call telling you whether you got the job? The disjunction of candidate propositions in context is a complete answer to that question. But it's no Grice maxim, it's not ruled out by the common ground, and so FUU predicts we update with it here. So notice, even if the conjunction wasn't ruled out by the common ground in the way I suggested, FUU would still predict that we update with the disjunction because it's a complete answer to the immediate question under discussion, and it's weaker than the conjunction. So it's sort of doubly determined that the update here is disjunctive. Okay, so let me catch my breath for a second here. So now what I want to do, and since a lot of you, or some of you are budding semanticists, let me recommend this procedure to you. Once you formulate a theory of anything, I've got this theory of Felicitous underspecification, the next thing you should do is take whatever thing you're looking at and embed it in stuff, right? Because I've had many theories, semantic theories that look really good for the unembedded stuff, and then you start embedding stuff and everything goes to hell, you know? So good thing to do. Okay, so recall the case of Jamie's trip to Costa Rica, and we suppose there was common ground that he went in May, July, or September. You asked where did Jamie go on vacation? That was the immediate question under discussion. I say Jamie went to Costa Rica. The series of months, May, July, September, are the range of candidate semantic values, and they determine the candidate propositions point in context. Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, July, September, and we claimed that we updated with the disjunction of those. Now, I assume that the set of Q alternatives for the question here are things like, and I just chose some places. Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, July, or September. Jamie went to San Clemente in May, July, or September. Jamie went to Mammoth Lakes in May, July, or September. I picked three really nice places, Costa Rica, San Clemente, and Mammoth, to make sure that Jamie had a nice vacation there. So the propositional update in context for one is a complete answer to the immediate question under discussion, right? It tells us that the first Q alternative is true and the other two are false. So it's a complete answer. Now, suppose we negate one. Jamie didn't go to Costa Rica. In principle now, so far there have been two ways to update: conjoin or disjoin the candidate propositions in context. As a result of embedding, we're now going to have a third possibility. And that's why this is kind of interesting. As before, we consider the candidate propositions in context for 1N. And those would be 1NA, 1NC. Jamie didn't go to Costa Rica in May. Jamie didn't go to Costa Rica in July. Jamie didn't go to Costa Rica in September. And then we could update with the disjunction or conjunction as we have in the past. But now there's a third possibility. We have a sentence embedded under negation now, and that gives us a new possibility for an update. We could update with the result of negating one's disjunctive update. Call that 1N's embedded update. I'm going to call that thing the embedded update. It's just the result of taking the unembedded update and embedding it under whatever construction you're looking at. In fact, in this case, we update with 1N's embedded update, or the conjunction of 1NA through 1NC, which are in this case equivalent. So in this case, the embedded update is equivalent to the conjunction. That will not in general be true. And you'll get all three possibilities. Sometimes the embedded update is equivalent to the conjunction. Sometimes it's equivalent to the disjunction. Sometimes it's equivalent to neither. Okay, so that's interesting. So the conjunction, the embedded update of the conjunction of 1NA through 1NC, it's stronger than the disjunction. It's not ruled out by the common ground, and it violates no Chrysian maxim. And it's a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion, which I'm assuming is the same as in the case of one. Where did Jamie go on his vacation? You ask, and I say, well, he didn't go to Costa Rica. Okay, so the question's the same here. So the embedded update, or the conjunctive update, settles as false one of the Q alternatives, where the disjunction of 1NA through 1NC doesn't settle any Q alternative. So it's not even a partial answer to the question under discussion. So FEU predicts that we update with 1N's embedded update, or equivalent with the conjunction of 1NA through 1NC. I should say, now that we've got three possibilities, instead of just the conjunction and the disjunction, we've got the embedded update too. FEU still tells you, so now there could in principle be three candidate propositional updates. FEU still says, take the weakest one that satisfies these conditions, right? Okay. Now, suppose we embed one under believes. Glenn believes Jamie went to Costa Rica. Here the candidate propositions are 1BA through 1BC. Glenn believes Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, in July, in September. As with 1N, I'm going to henceforth assume that the candidates for being the update in the cases of embedded felicitous under specified sentences are the embedded update, the conjunction of candidate propositions, or the disjunction of candidate propositions. Those are the propositional update candidates. Okay, if we assume that it's common ground that Glenn, like us, doesn't know whether Jamie went on vacation in May, July, or September, doesn't care, but he knows that he spent exactly one of those months in Costa Rica, and assume that the immediate question under discussion now is, where does Glenn believe Jamie went on vacation? Here, the tense on the verb went in the question is underspecified. So where did Jamie go on vacation, right? The tense on go there is underspecified. If we unpack that, then the Q alternatives here will be, Glenn believes Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, July, or September. Glenn believes Jamie went to San Clemente in May, July, or September. Glenn believes Jamie went to Mammoth Lakes in May, July, or September. And here we update with 1B's embedded update, the proposition expressed by 1b when the embedded sentence in 1b expresses one's update. And in this case, the embedded update is weaker both in the disjunction and the conjunction of 1ba to 1bc. So in this case, the embedded update is not equivalent to either of the other possible updates, okay? The common ground rules out the conjunctive update here because Glenn doesn't have any beliefs about which particular months Jamie spent in Costa Rica, and he doesn't believe that he spent all 3 months there, and that's all common ground, so the conjunctive update is ruled out by the common ground. Similarly, the common ground rules out the disjunction of 1ba through 1bc, since it's common ground that Glenn doesn't believe that Jamie spent any particular month in Costa Rica, but that just disjunction entails that he does. So that disjunction is also ruled out by the common ground. 1b's embedded update is a complete answer to the question under discussion by its Milgrom maxim and isn't ruled out by the common ground. So FEU says to update with it. So that's an interesting case, because, as I said, because the embedded update here isn't equivalent to either of the other two possible updates, and yet it is what we update with in this case. Okay, so finally, suppose we embed one under doubts. Glenn doubts Jamie went to Costa Rica. Here, 1DA through 1DC are the candidate propositions in context. Glenn doubts Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, in July, in September. Suppose again it's common ground that Glenn doesn't know which months Jamie spent in Costa Rica, and he knows that Jamie spent exactly 1 month in Costa Rica. In that case, conversational participant update with the conjunction of 1DA through 1DB, or equivalently 1D's embedded update. That is the proposition that Glenn doubts one state. Glenn doubts the following: Jamie went to Costa Rica in May, July, or September. Assuming the immediate question under discussion and the Q alternatives are the same as in the case of 1B, namely, where does Glenn believe Jamie went on vacation? And I respond, Glenn doubts Jamie went to Costa Rica. Then 1D's embedded update is a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion by its Milgrom maxims, not ruled out by the common ground. And so the weaker disjunction of 1DA to 1DC is not a partial answer to the immediate question under discussion. So FUU rules it out. Okay, so how are we doing on time? We're doing okay. I think, is it okay if I go on for about 10, 15 more minutes? Is that cool? All right. So now let's, I'll skip over a bunch of stuff, but let's look at the only example again. Only Ted Cruz compares himself to Galileo. We assumed that the candidate alternative sets are the ones listed on the handout. And so the candidate propositions in context for 7 are again 7A through 7D, as we saw before. And here we said you update with the conjunction of 7A through 7D. And recall that the immediate question under discussion here was, did some US politician in the 2016 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US other than Ted Cruz compare himself to Galileo? The set of Q alternatives here is the singleton, the set consisting of the single proposition, some US politician in the 2000 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US other than Ted Cruz compare himself to Galileo. We saw that FEU predicts the update with the conjunction of 7A through 7D. Now try negating this thing, giving you 7N, it's false that only Ted Cruz compared himself to Galileo. The candidate propositions now are 7NA through 7ND. It's false that Cruz compares himself to Galileo and no other US politician in the 2016 election cycle did. It's false that Cruz compares himself to Galileo and another prominent US politician did, and so on. I won't bother reading all those out to you. Assuming it's common ground that Cruz compared himself to Galileo after we saw him do it, it seems clear that we update with 7N's embedded update, or equivalently the disjunction of 7NA through 7ND. That is, what you're saying is at least one person in one of these alternative sets compared himself to Galileo in addition to Ted Cruz. That's what 7 seems to say. Okay, so the disjunction of 7NA through 7ND does settle the 1Q alternative for the question. Yeah, so the disjunction here settles the sole Q alternative. Remember that's just some member of one of these alternative sets compare himself to Galileo other than Cruz, right? The disjunction settles that Q alternative, doesn't violate a Gricean maxim, and is not ruled out by the common ground. And even though the conjunction of 7NA through 7ND is stronger, and I don't think it's ruled out by the common ground or anything else, FUU claims the update with the weaker disjunction here, and I think it's right. Because we're not saying, we're not saying some person other than Cruz in every alternative set compared himself to Galileo. We're just saying at least one person in one of those alternative sets compared himself to Galileo. Okay. Now try comparing, embedding 7 under believes. Andy believes that only Cruz compared himself to Galileo. Andy is said to believe the conjunction of 7A through 7D, or equivalently, we update with the conjunction of candidates' propositions for 7B in context. That proposition is stronger than the disjunction. But if we assume the question is, does Andy believe that some US politician in the 2016 election cycle, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US other than Ted Cruz compare himself to Galileo, then the conjunction of candidate propositions for 7B in context settles the sole QR alternative here. The disjunction doesn't. The conjunction isn't ruled out by the common ground or doesn't violate Gricean maxim. And so FUU correctly predicts we update with the conjunction of candidate propositions for 7B in context. I know this is a lot of data to absorb, by the way, so I'm sure some of it's not fully in mind. It isn't for me either. I got to go back and think about it. Finally, and this is the last case, embed 7 under doubts. Andy doubts that only Cruz compared himself to Galileo. Andy's being said to doubt the conjunction of 7A through 7D. That is, Andy's thinking somebody in some alternative set other than Cruz compare himself to Galileo. That's what Andy's thinking. So assume the immediate question under discussion here, assume it's the same as 7B. Namely, does Andy believe that roughly only Cruz compared himself to Galileo? So the sole Q alternative is Andy believes that some US politician in the 2016 election, or prominent US politician, or prominent world politician, or prominent person in political circles in the US other than Ted Cruz compared himself to Galileo. The embedded update for 7D is a complete answer to the immediate question under discussion. Both the conjunction of candidate propositions for 7D in context and their disjunction are stronger than 7D's embedded update. The latter, the disjunction, because it commits us to the claim that Andy doubts at least one of 7A through 7D, rather than merely doubting their conjunction, right? So, and I think what 7D does, it reports that Andy doubts the conjunction, not any particular conjunct. So FUU rightly predicts that with 7D, we update with its embedded update. Okay, relief, there will be no more data. As you can tell, I'm a very data-driven person. So let me summarize what the embedding data shows. Just kind of see the forest for the trees a little bit here. In the case of any given embedding, we can update with the embedded update, the conjunction, or the disjunction. Those are the 3 possibilities of embeddings. As we saw, in some cases, the embedded update is equivalent to either the conjunction or disjunction, but sometimes we saw like one case where it wasn't equivalent to either of those. It was distinct. And in the fuller range of embedded examples in the book, and believe me, there's a very full range of examples, as one referee complained. There are really, if you think about it, 5 possibilities here. And interestingly, they're all instance. They all actually, not only possibilities, they all are actual. So in the full range of embeddings in the book, we see all the possibilities instantiated in the sense that we get all the following updates. We get 1, the case where the update is the embedded update and it's equivalent to the conjunction of candidate propositions. 2, we get the case where the update is the embedded update and it's equivalent to the disjunction of candidate propositions. 3, we get the case where the update is the embedded update and it's not equivalent to either the disjunction or the conjunction of candidate propositions. 4, we get the case where the update is the conjunction of candidate propositions in context and not equivalent to the embedded update. And 5, we get the possibility where the update is the disjunction of candidate propositions and it's not equivalent to the embedded update. So that to me is a sign that you're on the right track when the theory allows 5 possibilities and you see all 5 instanced. So I think that's very good. Now let me just finally close. So I got maybe 5 minutes or so I'll take here and talk about the chapters in the book that I wasn't able to get to today, just to give us some idea of what's in the rest of the book. Coming to a bookshop near you soon, by the way. So basically, I walked you through parts of chapter 1. That's where I just give tons of examples of implicit underspecification and say intuitively what the update is. And in chapter 2, I formulate FUU, the rule I gave you here, and show that it predicts the updates we observe to be present in the cases I discussed in chapter 1. And that brings us to chapter 3. Now, in the material, I'll come back to it. I also then marched through parts of chapter 4 where I consider embeddings. Now, in all the material we've discussed so far, I've just said stuff like, okay, in this case, these are the range of candidate semantic values for the underspecified supplementive. I just made that claim. But there's a serious question, and let me pose it by talking about a more familiar question. In cases in which a supplementive gets assigned a unique semantic value in context, as I said at the outset, there's a question, what is the mechanism that does that? And there's a big debate over this. I myself have a theory about this. But when a supplementive gets assigned a unique semantic value in context, since the context invariant meaning alone can't do that, what is the mechanism by means of which that happens? Now, in the case, and I call that giving a meta semantics for the supplementive, how it gets a semantic value in context. There's an exactly analogous question for Felicitous underspecification. If a supplementive in a context gets associated with a range of candidate semantic values, what's the mechanism that associates that range of candidate semantic values with the supplementive? Just exactly the same question you get where there's a unique semantic value. And I think it's a beautiful thing. What I argue in chapter 3 is that my account of how it works in the case where supplementive gets a unique semantic value can be just, with a minor generalization, can predict how a supplementive that's underspecified gets associated with the range of semantic values. And I think it's a really beautiful thing that you can get then one meta-semantic theory that applies to both the case where you've got a unique semantic value in context and to the case where you've got an underspecified supplementive. So one meta-semantics does all the work. So I think that's a nice thing. Chapter 4 is the embeddings that we've talked about. Chapter 5 is an attempt to characterize appropriateness, a thing I touched on at one point. And the idea is you want to predict, you want to give a theory of a context being appropriate for an LF, where that includes the case where the LF contains an underspecified supplementive. And you want to define appropriateness in such a way that in an appropriate context, the LF is felicitous, unless there's some other kind of weird thing going on, like presupposition failure or something. And in an inappropriate context, the LF is infelicitous. And so in chapter 5 of the book, I give a definition of appropriateness that I claim does that work. And then the final chapter, chapter 6, I call it the problem of definites and possessives. Definites, and here the definites I'm focusing on are pronouns and demonstratives. And then they're possessives, Perez's car. I claim that all three of these expressions, singular, and I'm talking about the singular case now, singular pronouns, diacritically used, singular, simple and complex demonstratives, and possessives, all have what I'll call an implication of uniqueness. And I want to use that term, implication of uniqueness, in such a way that it's neutral with respect to how the implication arises. Is it entailed? Is it presupposed? Is it a matter of speaker-hearers recognizing uniqueness because of their linguistic competence? Is it something else? So, but the idea is that in these three kinds of expressions, singular pronouns, singular, simple, and complex demonstratives, and possessives, all have implications of uniqueness. I think in the case of possessives and pronouns and demonstratives, possessives on the one hand, pronouns and demonstratives on the other, the implications arise in different ways. With pronouns and demonstratives, I think they have a presupposition of uniqueness. I think they presuppose uniqueness. In the case of possessives, I think that can't be right for the following reason. If you consider uses of possessives a non-argument position, they don't suggest uniqueness at all. So if I walk up, I'm looking at a guy and I say, John's my brother, there's no implication that I have a unique brother at all. But now if you say my brother is John, all of a sudden that implication appears. Why? Interesting question, but it does. So I claim, to repeat, that pronouns and demonstratives have a presupposition of having unique semantic value. Possessives in argument position give rise to an implication of uniqueness in some complex way. But at any rate, there's an implication of uniqueness for all three expressions, at least in some cases in the case of possessives. Now, intuitively, that's bound to conflict with being underspecified. I mean, being underspecified is precisely not having unique semantic value. And yet, I said all three expressions have some implication to the effect that there is unique semantic value. So those things are bound to crash into each other, resulting in felicity. And indeed, I think that does happen. A lot of times when you try to formulate examples with these kinds of expressions of underspecified uses, you get infelicity precisely because being underspecified is clashing with the implication of uniqueness. But then that raises the difficult question, okay, but then why is it sometimes felicitous? Why, if these things are associated with implications of uniqueness, can you get felicitous under specified uses? And my answer to this in chapter 6 is, in the cases where you have felicitous under specified uses of these expressions, there are particular features that the examples possess. I call these features Felicity Enhancers that dampen the clash between being underspecified and having an implication of uniqueness. And so I've identified, I think at last count, 5 Felicity Enhancers, features an example can have. And I've gone through and noted that every time you get a felicitous underspecified use of one of these expressions with an implication of uniqueness, the feature possesses at least 2 of these Felicity Enhancers. And the idea is, again, they dampen the tension between the implication of uniqueness and being underspecified in such a way as to allow for felicitous underspecified uses. So I feel like I've talked too much at this point, and so I'll stop. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. What do you think if we have 5 minutes break and then Q&A? 5 minutos. Tengamos una pausa, una pausa de 5 minutos y volvemos para el tiempo de preguntas. Perfect.
Nurit, can you hear me? You can hear me, but do you see me?
Yeah.
You guys see me? Why don't I see me?
Oh,
I see. Well, wait. What's going on here? But well, oh, there we are. Okay, good.
Good. So let's start with questions. Andres, you moderate?
Yeah. I'm going through my the queue. So just give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay, so let's start with Nurit. I think you have.
Yeah, I had so I was wondering about I as a pure indexical, and
Yeah.
And I was wondering about this example. I forget how it goes, but I think it's something like, I've left my children in my house and I've told them not to open the door to anyone. And then I knock on the door and they open the door and I tell them something like, I could have been Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about cases like those where, I recognize it's not like the standard use of I, but there do seem to be like a series of candidates. Like it's not sure if I is picking out like the person that knocked on the door or the person that went up to the door, or the person that was trying to get in, or yeah.
Excellent question, Nurit. Am I pronouncing that right, Nurit?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay. It's just a parenthetical remark. When I was growing up, I mean, my name is Jeff King, right? And at the beginning of the school year, when they'd go to read students' names, I always felt really bad because I knew they were never going to get my name wrong. And all these kids whose names get butchered, I just felt so horrible. I was like, God, they're never going to get my name wrong. So I've got sort of a simple name guilt or something like that. That's a great question, Nurit. So I actually have a paper on that, which I'd be glad to send you if you're interested. That doesn't mean I'm not going to attempt to answer your question, but I just thought I'd throw that out there. Yeah, no, it's actually not published yet, but it's coming out, I think in fall or something like that. But so those examples, and maybe Nurit, you know this, but they're due to Jeff Nunberg, I think, originally. Actually, Nunberg in the original paper might cite someone else's suggestion. But anyway, they first appeared in the literature, I think the late 70s with one of Nunberg's papers. And well, just a little bit of background, actually. There were 3 kinds of examples that he considered. Let's see if I can remember them all. Yeah. So that was one, and it's funny because exactly that. The example was, I live in a bad part of town. You knock on my door. I open the door hastily without hesitation, and you say, what are you doing? I could have been a murderer. And then the second kind of case was we're watching the Pope in parade, and he's very much in Pope regalia. And I say, he's usually Italian. Now that's ambiguous, but it has a reading where you're not saying that guy is usually Italian. You're saying something like the Pope's usually Italian. And then the third kind of example is the prisoner can a prisoner, and they're telling him, okay, tomorrow's your last meal, you're having chicken. He says, wait a minute, I'm traditionally allowed to order whatever I want for my last meal. Now that can be true even if the tradition says nothing about the individual prisoner, right? And so the puzzle in all these cases looks similar, right? The puzzle looks similar. It's like these indexicals aren't doing the thing they usually do. And Nunberg referred to these things as having descriptive readings. That's what he put it. And he had this elaborate theory, which I argue in my paper just doesn't work. And one of the things I think one of the mistakes he made, I believe, is these examples just don't all work the same way at all. When you start considering more elaborate versions of them, they exhibit really different kinds of behavior. And to me, that's a warning sign that you don't have a homogeneous semantic phenomenon here. And of course, Nunberg tried to give a single theory to cover all these. And if they exhibit serious differences in behavior, that just looks doomed. So now your example, the murder example, I think is the most interesting and the most intractable in a certain kind of way. The other examples, the other kinds of examples, I'm traditionally allowed, blah, 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 versus he's usually Italian, blah, blah, blah. Those two things you can pretty much get a good handle on, and they work differently, but you can give good theories of both. Your kind of example, I can give a theory of it in the following sense. I give a semantics that I call shifty semantics. And what it does is it shifts the semantic significance of the indexical in a certain kind of way. And roughly speaking, what it does is I take it. Do you have the intuition, Nuri, that in that example, I'm saying something like the person knocking on the door could have been a murderer? I'm conveying something like that claim. And so I think the way this works is, in these examples, I refers to the individual as always, but then instead of that individual being the semantic value and going into the proposition, so to speak, it's some salient individual concept instanced by that individual that goes in here. And so here it's important that what goes into the proposition is the person knocking at the door, but it's important that I refers to the person who satisfies that individual concept in the context of utterance. And so I can give a semantics for this in the sense that it generates all the right readings and so on, but why does that happen? That I don't know. So I guess, so a fuller answer to your question is, that's a fascinating phenomenon. It's really, really intractable. I think I have a semantics that gets it all right, but I'm uneasy in the sense that I don't know. My semantics doesn't explain why this shift occurs. And you think you want an explanation of that in some sense. And I don't have such an explanation. But I do think, not that you were suggesting otherwise, I don't know what you were, but I do think it's a quite different phenomenon from Felicitous underspecification. But I take it the reason, is this the reason you raised it, Marie? I'm just curious. Because you're saying, well, look, sometimes I doesn't seem to refer to the speaker exactly, or it's doing something somewhat different. Is that your thought?
It was more on the side that, so whatever is the individual concept that you would pick out in the example that you give, it seems that there would be like a bunch of other candidates in the neighborhood for what could be the individual concept that's going to be contributed. So it was because of that.
Exactly, and good. And so that's exactly one of the issues here. Given that the person at the door, let's put it a different way. Given that the person I refers to there satisfies a lot of individual concepts, how exactly do we recover intuitively the correct one? And it's funny because I think the intuition here is extremely robust, that the right one is person knocking at the door, or make it a little more fancy, but something like that, right? I mean, who are you saying could have been a murderer? Well, it just seems like you're conveying the proposition that the person knocking at the door could have been a murderer, instead of you, by the way. Because just one other little thing to note here, it's important to and Recanati, who's discussed this, I think really screwed this up. It's important that let's see if I can put it in the right way. Yeah, okay, so sharpen the case in the following sense. You know, I always use my friend Glenn in all my examples. So I get a knock on the door, I open the door, it's Glenn, he says, "What are you doing? I could have been a murderer." Now, that looks like an epistemic modal there, right? It's something like, for all you know, the person at the door is a murderer, right? And so why did you open the door, kind of thing. So it's important in formulating the example that you specify that the person answering the door knows, once he sees the person knocking the door, knows that that person isn't a murderer. That's absolutely crucial to getting the example right? Because the epistemic modal claim, "I could have been a murderer," seems true, but then it can't have anything to do with the actual person, because, you know, I know that person's not a murderer, so it's false that for all I know that person's a murderer. I know that person isn't a murderer. So that it's important in considering these examples that you formulated just right, so you get the right tension, right? So the puzzle is this: given that I know you're not a murderer, and you said I could have been a murderer, and that seems true, what the heck is I doing there, and why? So I can answer the what the heck is I doing there, but I can't answer is why. But that's a very cool question to read. It's good. And let me know if you want to see the paper.
Can I have a follow-up on that?
Sure.
I was just thinking, I was trying to construct a case. I might not be, maybe I'm failing into it, but just going to give you the case. Suppose I'm watching a recording of my son opening the door, right? I have like a security camera, and I see a person showing up in the door. I don't recognize the person. A lot of people come to the apartment for some reason. And I say, well, that person might be a murderer. I'm telling my son, like, that person might be a murderer. And then I recognize myself, I am that person. So I can make the argument, that person might be a murderer. I am that person, therefore I might be a murderer. So I was just trying to trigger the intuition that I am saying something about myself. I'm saying something about that person. Like, I'm not saying just something about, you know, kind of descriptive, a purely descriptive proposition. Because the first proposition that I'm asserting, namely that that person might be a murderer, sounds clearly like a singular proposition. And if the argument is valid, then I'm concluding also a singular proposition about me, right? And I'm using I to refer to me and to utter a singular proposition. I don't know if the case was correct or, but I was thinking about
and of course that's a very different case, right? Because there I think you're right that the indexical expression is functioning in the usual way. The puzzle, though, I think is, so don't you find that the argument you were making doesn't work? Namely, if I say that person is a murderer, I can only, or that person might be a murderer, sorry. I can only say that assuming I know I'm not a murderer. I can only say that when I'm failing to recognize that person's me, right? Once I recognize it's me, I'm going to withdraw the claim, right?
Yeah, but the argument is correct in a different way, right?
What's that?
You know, kind of, the argument still feels valid in a different sense. I know that it is not something you will utter, but that doesn't mean that it's not valid.
I don't know if it's valid or not, but here's the problem. If I say that person's a murderer, and now I discover I'm that person. That person might be a murderer. And now I discover, and I know I'm not a murderer. And now I discover I'm that person. I don't think I can say now I might be a murderer. That just seems a bad thing for me to say. Now, explaining that, that could be hard. But I just think once you recognize yourself, you're two things. You're no longer going to say that person might be a murderer, and you're definitely not going to say I might be a murderer either. Do you agree with those judgments?
Yeah, I totally agree that you cannot say that. I was just probably trying to appeal to a sense of validity that comes from just substitution of.
Yeah, and I wasn't saying, that's why I kind of use this hedgy notion, like the argument's bad. I'm not. Yeah. I don't know what to say about validity, strictly speaking, but there's something wrong there, because there's been a shift in. Well, a shift takes place when you utter the second premise, in the sense that now you recognize you're that person. And now you should no longer say that person might be a murderer, nor should you say I might be a murderer. You shouldn't say either thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
I agree with that part.
yeah. So, but in a way, you're right to say that doesn't address the question of whether maybe the argument's valid anyway. It's just this observation that under those circumstances, once that shift occurs, you're no longer entitled to say those things. By the way, just one other thing about this, and this is one of the ways that the examples that you and Nareed are talking about are sort of interestingly different from some other cases that I mentioned from Nunberg. You can even, so here's an argument that whatever is going on here, it doesn't have to do with indexicals. Suppose I live in a bad part of town and you're with me in my apartment and there's a knock on the door. I, without hesitation, open it. It's a student of mine. 10 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. I open it. It's another student of mine. And this keeps happening. At some point, you can say to me, what are you doing? You know, every student who appeared at your door today could have been a murderer. Now, that's perfectly good. And what you're saying intuitively is that each of these people at the door could have been a murderer instead of a student. And so there's no indexical at all, and you get this, what looks to me like the same phenomenon. So I think the phenomenon here has nothing to do specifically with indexicals. In fact, I even get it with names, right? Josh knocks on my door. I open it, and you say, what are you doing? Josh could have been a murderer. Perfectly good, same thing's going on. So I think this phenomenon has nothing specifically to do with indexicals, unlike some of the other cases I mentioned. So he's usually Italian. You can't get that with quantifiers or names. You know, Jeff's usually Italian. I don't care what Jeff's doing. That means Jeff's usually Italian. Right? And that's a weird thing to say, since I'm not ever Italian.
Good. Next, I have Pyro.
Thank you, Jeff, for the talk. I have a very general question that maybe you can help me understand. So I'm interested in what kind of conditions are the felicity conditions. So there's a sense in which the felicity of a sentence or of a conversation is set by practical goals and interests of the speakers. So I'm just trying to understand why should our semantics differentiate the treatment in felicitous cases and non-felicitous cases? I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm sorry, say that last bit again. Why should?
Our treatment, our theory of language, our treatment of language, our semantics should tell us something about. So what should it treat differently felicitous cases and not non-felicitous cases, since apparently something else is making the job of setting if something is felicitous or not. Or I don't know if it makes sense. So I just want to have an idea of what is felicity and how is it determined.
Well, that's a very difficult question. So thanks for that. I said I reserve the right to move on. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so let me back up for a little bit. Usually, the way we understand felicity, it's not homogeneous. That is, I think that something can be infelicitous for example, for syntactic reasons. I think something can be infelicitous for pragmatic reasons, and I think something can be infelicitous for semantic reasons. Just to give you an idea, you know, so take the old. And I take this to be infelicitous. It's raining, but I don't believe it's raining. Now, you know, a lot of ink has been spilled on why that sounds bad to say, but it seems to be, it's roughly something like when you say it's raining, you're representing yourself as at least believing it's raining, if not knowing it's raining. And so when you say it's raining and then you say, but I don't believe it's raining, you've done something, you've sent very mixed messages. In asserting it's raining, you represent yourself as believing, maybe knowing it's raining, and then you say you don't believe it. So that I take it to be a pragmatically driven case of infelicity. and then a semantically driven one would be something like, I stopped smoking, but I never smoked. I think what's going on there is when you say I stopped smoking, that presupposes that you smoked. And now you're asserting the denial of something that you said you're presupposing. And so that's given that I think the presupposition here is semantically triggered by stopped smoking, that I think the explanation of the infelicity there is semantic. So, so infelicity can have a lot of different kinds of sources. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier. Like, so what is infelicity? Well, it's just sort of like, that sentence is bad. And now the challenging question for the theorist is, since that's all it means, that sentence is bad, now you've got to start doing some real theoretical work to say why that sentence is bad. Is it syntactic? Is it pragmatic? Is it semantic? And why? And so forth. Does that all make sense? That this is like a heterogeneous phenomenon that can be a result of syntax, semantics, or pragmatics. It's just badness of some sort. And so now, okay, but what am I doing here? Well, what I'm doing here, and this really goes back to the stuff I mentioned about chapter 6. I said that I think that pronouns, demonstratives, and possessives all have implications of uniqueness, and that clashes with being unspecified, underspecified. And so that can be a source of infelicity. You've just got something that has an implication of uniqueness, it's now underspecified, those things clash, that produces badness. And in some cases, I think that does happen. And then, so the question really, I think, is the other way around. When these things are felicitous, why is that? And and I mentioned before that I think it's because these features, these examples can have that dampen the conflict between being underspecified and an implication of uniqueness. But so I hope this helps. For my purposes, the kind of infelicity that arises in my cases, and the kind I'm concerned with, is the kind that results from being triggered by being underspecified. Now, I focused on pronouns, demonstratives, and possessives and their implications of uniqueness, but actually, to put my cards on the table, I think, and I'm not sure exactly how to understand this theoretically, but I think for all these contextually sensitive expressions that aren't pure indexicals, anyway, what I'm calling the supplementas, I think there is some, let me just use this very neutral term, presumption of having unique semantic value. In non-weird cases, and weird doesn't mean felicitous, but in usual cases, speakers and hearers strive for unique semantic values for these expressions, right? And so in many cases, when you don't get that, you get infelicity, okay? So final remark on this, I guess, infelicity, I think, is always, in the cases I'm interested in here, is always driven by being underspecified. And then felicity is the thing that needs explaining. Why do you get felicitous underspecified uses? And as I said before, I think it's because of certain features these examples can have that dampen the clash between the implication of uniqueness or the drive for unique semantic value and being underspecified. Let me see. Let me think for a second. Okay, so one, just to give you an example, one kind of felicity enhancer is when the candidate semantic values are very intimately related, and I'll try and say what I mean by that, and the speaker's intentions didn't clearly distinguish between. So here's an example. I go into a store and there's a bunch of shirts, identical shirts on a rack, and there's one maybe sitting up displayed and then against a background of a bunch of identical ones. And I say, that shirt's beautiful. Now, it's easy to imagine that in uttering as I did, my intentions weren't clearly distinguishing the type from the token, right? Were you saying the type is beautiful, or are you saying the token is beautiful? In some cases, I might distinguish those in intending to convey what I'm trying to convey. But it's easy to imagine a case where I just didn't really give it any thought and said, that sure is beautiful. You say, when you talk about the type or the token, I say, well, just didn't really cross my mind, to be honest. Okay. In a case like that, I think this property of what I'm calling intimacy, namely types and tokens are very intimately related. That is a token of that very type, in the sense that the token produces a lot of properties of the type and determines a lot of properties of the type and so on. The type is instancing, the token is instancing the type and so on and so forth. So there's an intimate relation with these two things. They weren't clearly distinguished by my intentions. That contributes to felicity in a case like that. So it's properties like that. So that's one of my felicity enhancers. There are a bunch of other ones, but that's one of them. Let me give you one more example since we're on the topic. It really is kind of fun. So there's another one that I call prospective uniqueness. And this is where, though there's not a unique semantic value, in some sense, there's the prospect of there being one. Okay, so here's an example to illustrate that. Suppose I'm watching a martial arts tournament, and there's 4 groups who are going to compete. The groups come in, they start practicing together as groups. And looking around at the groups, I notice the one group, the members of that group are all bigger and more skilled than the other members of the other groups. And so I point at that group and say, and remember, each group is going to have to produce a quarterfinalist, and then they'll battle it out and get to the champion. And I say, that quarterfinalist is going to win the tournament, pointing at the group, the one group. Okay, now, obviously that's underspecified. I think it's quite felicitous. I've tried to know tons of people. Nobody has any problem with it. One of the properties that example has is there is going to be a unique quarterfinalist from that group, right? And so I call that prospective uniqueness. And I think it's that, among other things, that's again, another felicity enhancer. It's that makes the example eases the way for it being felicitous, even though it's underspecified, and even though I think the monsters presuppose uniqueness. So that's the story.
Good. Next, I have Eduardo.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. I really like the talk.
Oh, thanks.
Now, so I was wondering. So you have given a very nice pragmatic picture of context updating, but one could argue that you can even extend the view that you are giving to all sorts of expressions in natural language. So I'm thinking people like Petrosky or Chomsky, who believe that
isn't that the same guy?
Yeah, almost. Who think that polysemy is the rule. You see, Jeff, that's great theory, but you're still looking for the semantic value. Why do we need that? Just forget about the semantic value. We are so all you're giving us is evidence that the way we do semantics, or that philosophers and logicians do semantics, is broken, and that we need to change that. So there's no interpretation function. There's no one unique value. All we have are this information that tell us to look for something that fill in the gaps. And of course, we are looking for something unique, but that's not semantic. What triggers that is our need to know what the speaker is asserting or thinking about. But it has nothing to do with semantics. The semantics doesn't impose this need for just one proposition that we need to look for. So I'm wondering, what do you think of a view like that, and if you disagree with that kind of picture, what role does semantics or meaning have in these updates?
Well, first of all, you know, I mean, it's good. It's a very good question. But first of all, I think that, I mean, I think Chomsky says just crazy stuff about polysemy. I mean, I think he's just crazy. I mean, there's, you know, polysemy is a real thing. I believe in it. But Chomsky gives all these examples involving polysemy and seems to think that somehow this undermines semantics in some way. And I just can't. By the way, I also have a paper on this, arguing that none of Chomsky's arguments cast any doubt on being able to give semantics for an I language, and not a Chomskyan semantics, a real, what I call external semantics of the sort we're all familiar with and fond of. So I think his arguments are just bad. One thing, okay, so there's that. I don't buy any of Chomsky's arguments involving polysemy, and they usually, most of them do, although there's these Joe Sixpack examples too and so forth. I don't think any of those arguments are good arguments for the conclusions he draws from them. Just to give you one kind of example, I do think you can do funny things with polysemy, right? I think when you take a polysemous expression and then follow it up with a pronoun, the initial expression can have, so here's how I'm thinking of polysemy. A word can be polysemous, but then in a given context, it may be that there's one of the polysemous meanings that's active in that context, right? And so you're saying the thing resulting from that polysemous meaning. So suppose that's right. So suppose I say the book is on the desk. I take it in that case, one of the polysemous meanings of book is sort of material thing, and that's the polysemous meaning that's being accessed there. But I can say something like, the book is on the table. The book is on the table, and you can buy it at Thrifty. Where the it there, it has some different polysemous meaning from the book. And so I think you can do this in cases of polysemous meanings, assuming the polysemous meanings are close enough together. I don't know quite how to make that precise. Close enough together, it'll work. Do you get my drift? So the antecedent for the anaphor has one polysemous meaning. The anaphor itself has a different polysemous meaning. So in this case, it's material object meaning versus abstract object meaning, or something like that. But that's not very surprising. And when the meanings aren't far apart, things can kind of go bad. So, or try this kind of case. You know, this sounds to me like either a joke or bad. So he held his wife in an implausible view about Watergate. Either that's funny or it's just bad, or it's not a good thing to say. And that's, I take it, because the polysemous meanings there are sufficiently far apart that it just doesn't work. So that's one thing. But now coming back to, I think, the other aspect of what you're getting at, so I just reject these Chomsky and Petrosky kinds of arguments from polysemy to anything deep about semantics not being done in the way we usually do it or something like that. So in this paper I've written on the topic, I take Chomsky's arguments and I argue that none of them show, assuming I buy his I language, public language distinction, and I languages are the good ones, I don't think it shows at all that you can't do a standard kind of semantics for I languages where you assign, you know, individuals to names, properties to predicates, and so on. It just works the same way it always works. But now I take it, Eduardo, another thing you were getting at, if I understood you, and correct me if I didn't, is that you might have a case of a polysemous word where in the context of utterance, it's underspecified which polysemous meaning is being accessed. Yeah. That was your thought? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a very interesting, that's very good. And so you're suggesting to me maybe my view has wider application here because maybe it would apply to those kinds of cases as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, good. To be honest, I hadn't really thought about that. That seems right. And that's kind of related, by the way, a little bit related to Narit's early example about here. But anyway, I think that's quite possible. I have to think about that. I think the hard thing is going to be, in a lot of cases, yeah, okay, that is going to be interesting. So the hard thing is going to be finding a case where, again, where the Possessives meanings are sufficiently close together, given what you're predicating of the relevant thing, the predication is consistent with a number of different Possessives meanings, where nothing else in the context of utterance suggests a unique one, right? And so that's going to be the challenge, is coming up with good examples like that. But that seems quite possible, and that's a very interesting suggestion. That's right down worthy, Eduardo. That's very
Okay, good.
But was there something else I was missing though about the Chomsky
Well,
arguments?
if that's no the Chomsky, but the second part. So if we can give this story about polysemy, and I mean, assuming that we have different candidates and we need to update, and we can give your story to account for those. But then another thing that this view can suggest is that, well, maybe we should give up the notion of semantic value. So what we're looking for, we can do all this with a lot of pragmatics and very little semantics. And semantics, at least if we understand semantics as giving us an interpretation function that fixes one of the propositions, we're giving up that picture because of the kind of evidence that you're presenting. Is that a route that you'll be happy to take, or not?
No, because I mean, except in politics, I'm kind of conservative. So my view is, I mean, look, I think, well, okay, I do think there are many cases, and this is where I think Petrosky and Chomsky are overstating their case, or their case isn't as strong as they think it is. I think in many cases, you do express unique propositions, and words do have unique semantic values. And I think this is very true with indexicals. I mean, singular pronouns and demonstratives, it's very often very clear what the unique semantic value is, and there is such a thing, and so on. And so I think, I don't want to give up on that picture. I just want to add the following conservative amendment. Yeah, and sometimes, but sometimes, and maybe even lots of times, we don't do that. We get real underspecification. But now, given that I'm making a kind of conservative move here, I think in general we do express unique propositions. Words do have unique semantic values, and then these interesting cases I'm looking at, we don't, and maybe some of the Possessives cases you're thinking of too. But then, if I'm right, that in general, we are looking for unique semantic values in general, then I need to give an explanation for why we nonetheless have Felicity. Now, if I were willing to go down the road you are suggesting, I wouldn't have that additional burden. You just say, well, look, it's never there's no norm or presupposition or anything that there would be unique semantic values for words or unique propositions expressed by sentences. So there's nothing in general to explain about Felicity. But see, if you do that, what worries me is, why then do you get lots of infelicity in cases where you get underspecification, where it does seem like the underspecification is the source of the implicit? Okay, so simple example. I keep saying everything's expensive. This is actually an example from Imogen Dickey attacking me, but incorrectly. I keep saying everything's expensive, and you accuse me of being this cynical person who's just going on about the expensiveness of everything, and there's nothing you think is cheap, Jeff. And I go, no, that's not true. And you're facing me. I go, that's not true. Like, that's cheap, that's cheap. And you turn around and there's like 100 things, all of which could be cheap or not cheap behind you. I take it my utterance is infelicitous there. And it's an interesting case, because when I asked informants about this, informants just agree that's bad, okay? But it's interesting because not only, given the interest we have in the conversation, namely, does Jeff think anything is cheap? I've addressed that question. I think there are cheap things, right? You don't know which things I think are cheap, but the question was, do I think anything's cheap? I've answered the question. So why is that bad? I take it the only explanation I can think of is it's underspecified in just a bad way, right? Or again, I out of the blue say, we're sitting silently working together. I out of the blue say, oh, he's an idiot. No salient mail, nothing. That's just bad. Why is it bad? It's bad because it's underspecified. So I worry that going down the road you're suggesting, there's just no explanation for why these things are bad. Because underspecification is just the usual thing. So, well, why is it bad? So that's why I don't want to go down that road.
Okay, that's helpful. That's good.
Good, really good question though. Like I really do have to think about that Possessive stuff. By the way, I for other reasons I was looking into Possessive about a year or so ago, and it turns out the literature is very difficult. The serious literature on Possessive is just incredibly dense and difficult. So that has slowed me down a bit on that topic.
Thanks. So sadly, we are out of time, but please join me in thanking Professor King for this excellent talk. We're going to have our electronic round of applause. Y para quienes nos han estado, yeah.
If I could just say, I thank all of you. Your questions were excellent, and I really appreciate it. I've made a lot of notes on them, so that's always a sign of a good question session. So thanks, everybody. It was very helpful.
Thanks very much.
Y para quienes nos han estado viendo por Facebook, gracias también. Eso terminaría la presentación por hoy, pero nos vemos el próximo lunes.